Welcome to the deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us for this one because we're tackling something today that I think speaks to a very specific kind of curiosity.
Yeah, it really does.
Like if you're listening right now, you are probably the type of person who isn't satisfied with just, accepting how things look on the surface.
Right. You want to know how the machine actually works.
Exactly. You're always hunting for that aha moment, that realization that fundamentally flips the way you perceive the physical world around you.
And today is definitely one of those moments.
Oh, absolutely. Because the mission for this deep dive is to look at one of the most common, everyday physical phenomena in the universe.
Yeah.
Something you interact with constantly.
Every single day.
And we are going to completely rewire how we understand it. We're going to break down the concepts of chaos, flow, order, and specifically, we're going deep into the science of turbulence.
It's genuinely a complete paradigm shift. I mean, we're dealing with a physical reality that is just completely ubiquitous.
It's everywhere.
It is. It's in the water flowing from your tap. It's in the air pushing against your car on the highway. It dictates global weather patterns.
Yeah.
And yet, structurally speaking, it has been so deeply misunderstood by mainstream science for over a century.
Over a century. Okay, let's unpack this because to figure out where we went wrong, we're looking at a stack of incredibly dense but genuinely fascinating source materials today.
Very dense, but so worth it.
The anchor for all of this is a groundbreaking 2026 paper by the physicist Philip Lillian. It's titled The Closure Ladder of Turbulence, a continuum ontological framework.
Kind of mouthful.
It is, yeah. But we've got the full text of the paper, we have the executive summary briefing document, and we also have this beautiful, highly detailed infographic that visually maps out his new theory.
And it really helps to have that visual.
It does. But to start, we need to address the elephant in the room. How have we historically been taught to think about fluids and turbulence?
Right, the old way of thinking.
Because if you take a high school physics class or even if you go study advanced aerodynamics, turbulence is basically presented as the enemy of order. Right?
That is exactly the traditional framework. Historically, turbulence has always been framed as randomness. It's taught as a state of pure disorder.
Just total chaos.
Exactly. In fact, if you look at classical fluid dynamics textbooks, turbulence is quite literally defined as the breakdown of laminar flow.
Laminar meaning like the smooth flow.
Yes. Laminar meaning smooth, orderly, parallel layers of fluid. The classical narrative is that a fluid is flowing nicely, behaving itself, and then due to too much speed or an obstacle, it loses its structural integrity.
The math just breaks down.
The math breaks down and it just goes chaotic. It's treated almost like a failure of the fluid.
Like a glitch in the physics. Like the fluid was trying its best to be smooth, it tripped, and now it's just a mess of random splashing.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here is how entirely Philip Lillian dismantles that foundational assumption.
He just tears it down.
He introduces what he calls a radical ontological shift. Now, in philosophy and science, ontology is the study of the nature of being.
Like what things actually are.
Right. It's the study of what things fundamentally are at their core. And Lillian is arguing that our fundamental definition of what turbulence is has been completely backward.
Backward, okay.
He argues that turbulence is not a state of disorder, it is not randomness. And I want to quote directly from the executive summary here because this is the crux of the entire paper, and it is a heavy sentence.
Lay it on us.
He writes, "Turbulence is the progressive imposition of closure upon an originally smooth fluid continuum."
The progressive imposition of closure.
I know, it's dense.
That's a very dense academic phrase.
Wait.
We are going to spend the rest of this deep dive unpacking exactly what imposition of closure actually means in the real world.
We definitely need to.
But I want to pull a quote from the infographic that I think translates that idea perfectly. It says, turbulence is not the negation of order, but the structured evolution of order under increasing closure pressure.
The structured evolution of order.
So it's not breaking down. It's evolving.
It's a highly organized, mathematically rigorous defensive mechanism against external stress.
A defensive mechanism.
Yes. It is the fluid doing exactly what it must do to survive the energy being forced into it.
I love that framing.
Yeah.
So here's the goal for you, listening right now. By the time we finish walking through this paper, I promise you will never look at a swirling cup of coffee or a rushing river or the wake behind a ferry boat in the same way again.
You really won't.
You are going to see the hidden mathematical matrix that is holding all of that supposed chaos together.
But to get to the chaos, we actually have to start with the calm.
Right. We have to understand what a fluid is doing when it's just minding its own business.
And in Lillian's framework, the starting point is the fluid in its minimally perturbed state. He calls this the continuum layer.
The continuum layer.
When a fluid is not being aggressively bothered by outside forces, its primary dominant characteristic is what he describes as distributed flow and continuous variation.
Okay, let's visualize that. Imagine you have a jar of honey, and you're pouring it very, very slowly onto a piece of toast.
Great visual.
That thick, perfectly smooth, glassy ribbon of honey falling through the air. There are no breaks in it, no sudden jumps in speed, no swirling.
No.
It is acting as a completely unified whole. Is that what he means by the continuum layer?
That is a perfect example of what Lillian calls ideal continuum dominance. And there is a mechanical reason it maintains that smooth, glassy unity.
What's the reason?
It is due to a crucial concept in this paper called the continuum smoothing capacity. We're going to refer to this variable as C.
Okay, so C is like the fluid's internal shock absorber.
Exactly. You can think of the C variable as the fluid's innate buffer. It's an internal property of the fluid itself, dictated primarily by its viscosity, its density, and the internal friction between its molecules.
So it's built in.
It is.
Yeah.
This capacity, the C, allows the fluid to absorb tiny local perturbations and redistribute them so that the whole system stays smooth.
So if a tiny speck of dust or a crumb hits that flowing ribbon of honey,
The honey doesn't suddenly shatter into a chaotic splash.
right?
Its continuum smoothing capacity, its C value, is high enough to absorb the impact of that crumb.
It just takes the hit.
It dampens the kinetic energy of the impact, and it seamlessly redistributes that energy across the surrounding molecules of the fluid.
Wow.
The local disturbance is effectively ironed out, and the continuum remains dominant. The fluid is actively working at a molecular level to maintain its smooth state. It's a dynamic equilibrium.
But the universe is rarely perfectly calm.
Definitely not.
We don't live in a world of slowly poured honey. So what happens when the environment pushes back?
Well, that's the big question.
Like, what happens if I stop pouring the honey slowly and instead I blast it out of a high-pressure nozzle? Or what happens when a calm, slow-moving river suddenly hits a steep drop-off filled with jagged rocks?
That is where Lillian introduces the concept of partial closures.
Partial closures.
When the external forcing on the fluid increases dramatically, the fluid's smoothing capacity, that C variable, eventually gets overwhelmed.
It just can't keep up.
The mathematical reality is that it simply cannot smooth everything out fast enough. The kinetic energy being violently injected into the system cannot be destroyed.
Right. Conservation of energy. That has to go somewhere.
Exactly. So the fluid begins to build localized structures to contain it. It starts to compartmentalize the energy.
Compartmentalize. That makes a lot of sense. And these structures it builds, these aren't invisible microscopic things, right? These are phenomena we have all seen with our own eyes.
Absolutely. They are shear layers, which occur when fast-moving water is forced to slide directly over slow-moving water.
Okay.
They are vortices, which are those little spinning whirlpools you see forming behind a rock in a fast stream.
Wait, I need to stop and clarify something here because this feels like the pivot point of the whole theory.
Go for it.
Historically, when fluid dynamicists looked at a vortex behind a rock, did they just view that as a random accident?
Essentially, yes. In classical modeling, those vortices and shear layers were often treated mathematically as cascading instabilities.
Instabilities.
Yeah.
Like a mistake.
They were viewed as the fluid failing to maintain its preferred smooth state, chaos ensuing from a breakdown in the laminar structure.
And Lillian disagrees.
Lillian completely rejects this premise. He argues that these structures, these vortices and shear layers, are deliberate, mathematically structured evolutions.
Deliberate.
The fluid is literally walling off or closing sections of itself to trap and contain the incoming energy that it can no longer broadly distribute.
Hence the term closure. It's closing off a section of the fluid to deal with a specific problem.
Exactly. The fluid is organizing the excess energy into highly specific, constrained local geometries. It is a localized solution to an overwhelming global problem.
It reframes everything because it destroys the old binary model.
It completely gets rid of it.
It's no longer a light switch where you flip it up for a laminar, smooth, good fluid, and you flip it down for turbulent, chaotic, bad fluid. It is a fluid gracefully and progressively transitioning along a spectrum, doing exactly what it physically must do to manage energy.
And if it is a spectrum, that means it can be measured.
The math.
Yes. To measure exactly where a fluid sits on that spectrum of transition, Lillian had to invent a new mathematical language. He had to formalize this concept of closure.
Okay, so If this isn't just a random binary switch from smooth to chaotic, how do we actually measure it? Did Lillian create a new formula to calculate where a fluid is on this spectrum?
He did, and this brings us to the formalization of what he calls closure intensity.
Which is represented in his equations by the Greek letter chi.
Yes, exactly.
If you're looking at the infographic we have here, you'll see this beautiful series of dials, almost like the tachometer on a sports car, and they explain this scalar value of chi. Walk us through how this dial works.
The closure intensity parameter, chi, is the numerical heart of this entire framework. It is a scalar value, meaning it represents a magnitude, and it ranges strictly from 0 to 1.
Let's ground this for the listener. If I have a fluid and I run the math, and chi equals exactly 0, what am I looking at?
You are looking at your perfectly smooth, slow-flowing honey. You are looking at ideal continuum dominance.
A baseline.
The fluid is completely unbothered by its environment, and that continuum smoothing capacity C is handling absolutely everything.
And on the absolute opposite end of the dial, if chi equals exactly 1.
That is what Lillian terms maximal admissible closure.
Maximal admissible closure.
This is the extreme absolute limit of localized structuring. It is the fluid being pushed to the very brink of its physical capacity to organize energy before the very nature of the fluid medium fundamentally collapses.
So anything in between those two absolutes, any state where chi is greater than 0 but less than 1 is a state of partial closure.
Correct.
But a dial is just a picture on an infographic. To actually prove this, Lillian had to build the engine that turns the needle on that dial, right?
Yeah.
He has to have an equation.
He does, and it is a surprisingly elegant formula. Here's where it gets really interesting. The core equation is chi equals phi of q divided by c.
Okay, hold on. Let's translate that for those of us who haven't taken calculus in a few years. Let's dissect this ratio, because you're saying this fraction is the key to understanding all turbulence.
I am. Let's look at the fraction itself first. Q divided by c. We already know the denominator, the bottom of the fraction.
Let's see, the continuum smoothing capacity.
Yes.
The fluid's natural inherent resistance to being broken up or structured.
Exactly. In the numerator, the top of the fraction, we have Q. Q represents the aggregate closure-driving quantities.
Closure-driving quantities.
It is the sum total of all the external and internal forces that are actively trying to push the fluid out of its smooth state.
So it's a literal mathematical battle.
It really is.
The force is trying to structure and disturb the fluid Q divided by the fluid's physical ability to resist that disturbance C.
Precisely. Now, if you divide Q by C, you get a number. But Lillian needs this value to fit neatly on his dial between 0 and 1.
So how does he do that?
That is where the phi comes in. Phi is a normalization function. Specifically, it is a monotone function.
Stop right there. Monotone function. That is a very textbook phrase. Does that just mean it's a one-way mathematical valve?
Basically.
Like, it scales the result of that battle so it fits on the 0 to 1 dial, and it ensures the relationship behaves predictably.
That is a great way to put it. It translates the raw physics of the Q over C battle into a neat, standardized sliding scale.
Nice.
It ensures that as the stress Q increases relative to the resistance C, the closure intensity chi reliably and predictably approaches 1.
Okay. I think I understand the engine, but we really need to spend some time on Q.
Yes, Q is complex.
Because Q isn't just some force. It's not a single thing. Lillian breaks Q down into 5 distinct measurable components.
He does.
In my notes, I started calling these the 5 horsemen of closure.
I like that.
Because these are the 5 specific physical forces that ride in to destroy the fluid's smooth continuum. I'm going to go through these one by one, because to really understand this paradigm shift, we need to know exactly what is happening under the surface. What is the first component of Q?
The first component of Q is denoted by a cursive F, which stands for the external forcing intensity.
External forcing intensity.
This is the most intuitive of the 5. It represents the raw, outside, macro-level physical push applied to the fluid system.
So if we were talking about the ocean, F would be a gale force wind whipping across the surface of the water.
Exactly. The wind is transferring kinetic energy directly into the fluid, forcing waves to form. Or, if you are looking at municipal infrastructure, imagine the massive industrial water mains under a city.
Right.
F is the massive mechanical pump forcing millions of gallons of water through that pipe at high speed. It is the brute force injection of kinetic energy into the system.
And the higher the F, the bigger the numerator Q gets, and the further Archie dial moves toward 1.
Exactly. The dial ticks up.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
What is the second horseman?
The second is B, representing boundary constraint strength.
Boundary constraint.
This is all about the physical spatial environment the fluid is forced to navigate. A fluid floating in an infinite empty void behaves very differently than a fluid squeezed into a tight corridor.
Right.
B measures how walls, obstacles, and surfaces force the fluid to adapt.
Because water can't travel through a solid object.
Exactly.
If a river encounters a massive boulder, the water has to bend, compress, and accelerate to get around it.
Yes, and that boundary actively imposes structure on the fluid. Think about the aerodynamics of a Formula One car.
Oh, perfect example.
The engineers spend millions of dollars designing the exact curvature of the carbon fiber body to manipulate the air flowing over it.
Right.
The surface of that car is an extreme boundary constraint. That's B. It forces the air to compress, to speed up in certain zones, and to generate downforce.
So the boundary itself is demanding that the fluid close off its continuum and form localized structures to get past the obstacle?
Precisely. Boundaries force adaptation.
Okay, the third component.
The third is S, which stands for shear concentration.
Shear concentration.
This occurs dynamically when adjacent layers within the fluid itself are moving at different velocities and are forced to slide against one another.
Like friction, but internally. Fluid rubbing against fluid.
Exactly. Imagine a wide, relatively slow-moving river. Now imagine a tributary shoots a very fast, narrow stream of water directly into the middle of that slow river.
Okay, I can picture that.
You now have a fast lane and a slow lane of water side by side. The boundary where that fast water rubs against the slow water creates intense internal friction. The fluid layers are shearing against each other.
And the fluid can't maintain its perfectly smooth continuum layer if half of it is trying to outpace the other half. It has to resolve that speed differential somehow.
It does. That intense friction demands localization. The fluid must create dedicated shear layers to act as a buffer between the fast and slow zones. It is structuring itself to handle the internal stress.
Which naturally leads right into the fourth component,
Yes.
which is V, vorticity localization.
Yeah,
I have to admit, when I was reading the paper, this one fascinated me the most.
it's very cool.
What happens when those shear layers we just talked about get too intense? Do they just snap?
They don't snap because it's a fluid. Instead, they spin.
They spin.
When the velocity differential across a shear layer becomes too extreme for a simple sliding boundary to handle, the layer curls in on itself. It creates an eddy. Vorticity is the measure of the spinning, swirling, rotational persistence within the fluid.
So when you stand on a bridge and watch water flow past the concrete pillars,
Yeah.
you see those little distinct whirlpools spinning off behind the pillar and traveling downstream.
Yes.
Historically, we just called that a random splash or a turbulent wake.
But under the closure ontology, those vortices are highly structured, localized cylinders of spinning energy.
Cylinders of spinning energy.
The fluid has actively organized the chaotic energy caused by the bridge pillar into a spinning top. It contains the energy within that rotational geometry so it doesn't tear the rest of the fluid apart.
That is so smart.
The more of those vortices that form and persist, the higher the V component goes.
It's building little energy containment units. That is incredible. And that brings us to the fifth and final horseman.
Yes, D, which stands for dissipation localization.
Dissipation localization.
Of the 5 components, this is perhaps the most profound shift in how we understand fluid mechanics. Dissipation refers to how kinetic energy is ultimately lost from the fluid system.
Right.
Which happens when the kinetic energy of movement is converted into heat through internal friction at the molecular level.
Okay, so how does a smooth, perfect continuum lose energy versus a turbulent one?
In a perfectly smooth, ideal laminar flow, where chi is near zero energy loss, is egalitarian. The tiny amount of heat generated by the fluid moving is spread evenly and uniformly throughout the entire body of the fluid.
Just dispersed everywhere.
Exactly. But as closure increases, as we add forcing, boundaries, shear, and vorticity, that energy loss is no longer distributed evenly. It concentrates.
It concentrates.
The fluid literally builds microscopic zones, intense little hot spots of friction, where energy is violently and rapidly burned off as heat. The fluid is localizing its own energy dissipation.
So instead of the whole fluid warming up by 1/1,000,000th of a degree, tiny microscopic pockets within the fluid heat up significantly to burn off the stress.
Exactly. It's an extreme form of structural compartmentalization.
I want to take all 5 of these extremely academic concepts and bring them right into the listener's kitchen.
That's a great idea. Let's ground it.
Let's think about your morning cup of coffee. You pour your coffee, you pour in a little bit of cold cream. At first, you don't do anything. The mug just sits on the counter. The system is calm.
Very calm.
The fluid's smoothing capacity, C, is dominant. The closure intensity dial, chi, is sitting at practically 0. Then you take a spoon and you start to stir.
The moment you start moving that spoon, you are introducing F, external forcing intensity. You are injecting kinetic energy.
And the spoon itself, the actual metal object moving through the liquid, acts as a boundary constraint, B. The liquid has to flow around it.
And as the coffee right next to the moving spoon accelerates, but the coffee near the ceramic edge of the mug stays relatively still, you create internal friction.
Right.
You have just introduced S, shear concentration.
And if I pull the spoon out quickly, I can actually see those little swirling whirlpools trailing behind it in the cream.
You are witnessing V, vorticity localization. The shear layers have curled into spinning containment structures.
And unseen to my naked eye, at a microscopic level inside those little swirls, the fluid is creating tiny hot spots of friction to burn off the energy of my stirring.
Which is D, dissipation localization.
That is just brilliant.
Precisely. By simply stirring your coffee, you are driving all 5 components of Q up simultaneously.
All at once.
And because your coffee's natural thickness, its viscosity, its smoothing capacity, C has not changed, it can no longer hide or absorb the energy you are adding. The ratio of Q divided by C skyrockets.
And the dial turns.
The math demands that the closure intensity, G, rapidly scales up toward 1. The smooth, distributed continuum of your coffee has been progressively, structurally closed into a complex, swirling matrix.
It is brilliant when you piece it together like that. But what Lillian argues in the paper is that this transition from the calm coffee to the swirling vortex doesn't just happen in a blurry, undefinable swoosh.
No, it's very structured.
He argues it happens in distinct, measurable, predictable stages, which means we aren't just looking at a dial. We are looking at a ladder.
Yes. If we connect this mathematical engine to the bigger picture of physical reality, Lillian is offering us an ordered family of thresholds.
Thresholds.
He labels these specific threshold values as Chi1, Chi2, Chi3, and Chi4. These mathematical values serve as the rungs on a ladder. He is structuring fluid transition as a definitive sequential ascent.
So it's a step-by-step process.
A fluid does not just leap from completely smooth to completely turbulent. It must pass through defined intermediate stages of partial closure.
The infographic illustrates this latter concept beautifully, and I want to paint a word picture of it for you. At the very bottom of the page, underneath the first rung, you have these sweeping, gentle, horizontal blue waves.
Very peaceful.
It looks incredibly peaceful, like a calm ocean swell. But as your eye moves upward on the page, following the shape of a ladder, passing those G thresholds, the waves start to crimp. They start to bend and curl.
And the colors change, too.
Yeah, the colors transition from cool blues to vibrant greens, then to fiery oranges, and finally to deep, bruised purples at the very top.
It's quite striking.
And the shapes transition from wide waves into incredibly tight, nested, recursive, almost fractal spirals. It is a visual representation of the continuum being progressively structured by pressure. I want to walk through this ladder with you, rung by rung, so we understand exactly what the fluid is doing at each stage.
We begin at the foundation, band 1. Lillian calls this the continuum dominant band. Mathematically, this is where the closure intensity chi is greater than or equal to 0, but strictly less than the first threshold, Chi1.
This is our baseline. This is the slow pouring honey. The flow is smooth. It is what engineers call near laminar.
Right.
Any tiny perturbations, like a little vibration or a tiny speck of dust, are instantly and easily redistributed by the fluid. The continuum is totally in control. The fluid is relaxed.
But as forcing increases, as we stir the coffee a little harder or the wind blows a little faster, we cross that first mathematical threshold, Chi1, and we enter band 2.
Band 2.
This is the incipient closure band. Here, Chi sits between Chi1 and Chi2.
Incipient meaning the very beginning stages.
Exactly. This is the first real shift in the ontological state of the fluid. The external forces are now strong enough that boundary effects and shear effects are becoming dynamically significant.
The fluid is waking up.
The fluid is essentially waking up to the forces being applied to it. It can no longer just blindly absorb everything. The very earliest, faintest beginnings of local structuring start to form. You might see the initial ripples of instability.
It's like when you're driving down the highway and you slowly accelerate. For a while, the car is perfectly smooth. But when you hit a certain speed, say 85 miles an hour, you feel the very first faint vibrations in the steering wheel.
That's an excellent analogy.
The system hasn't failed, but it is telling you it is beginning to experience meaningful stress.
The system is signaling that adaptation is required. If the speed keeps increasing, We cross the next threshold into band 3, which Lillian terms the transitional competition band.
Transitional competition.
This exists between Chi 2 and Chi 3. The key word here is competition.
What exactly is competing with what?
The fluid is no longer a unified whole. Multiple local closure zones have appeared, and they are fighting for dominance.
Oh, wow.
You have emerging shear layers competing against localized vortices. Different regions of the fluid are attempting to structure the incoming energy in different ways simultaneously.
So it's chaotic.
In this band, you see intermittent vortical structures, meaning little whirlpools will spin up, hold the energy for a fraction of a second, and then break apart, only to reform somewhere else.
Just flashing in and out.
It is a highly dynamic, wildly fluctuating state. The underlying continuum is fiercely battling against the imposed closures.
It sounds exhausting. It is the chaotic middle ground where the fluid hasn't quite figured out the optimal way to handle the stress yet.
Exactly.
But if you keep pushing, if you keep adding energy and increasing Q, the fluid eventually figures it out. It organizes. And you cross the threshold into band 4, the turbulent hierarchy band.
This band between Chi 3 and Chi 4 is critical because what Lillian calls the turbulent hierarchy band is exactly what traditional fluid dynamics textbooks would call fully developed turbulence.
Fully developed turbulence.
This is the state that has historically been labeled as pure chaos.
But Lillian is saying it's the exact opposite of chaos.
He is. In band 4, the fluid has established nested, multi-scale, interacting partial closures. The chaotic, intermittent, temporary structures from band 3 have solidified into a massive, cooperative, highly mathematically ordered hierarchy.
Hierarchy of structures.
You also see the full emergence of structured dissipation, those microscopic hotspots burning off energy. The fluid has built a complex, multi-tiered machine to handle the immense energy load.
We are going to put a pin in band 4 for a moment because the actual mechanics of how this hierarchy operates is so mind-blowing that it deserves its own dedicated segment in a few minutes.
Oh, it absolutely does.
But before we get there, we have to look at the very top of the ladder. What happens if you push the fluid past band 4?
You enter band 5, the extreme closure band. This is where Chi is greater than Chi 4, pushing right up against the absolute limit of 1.
When I was reading the executive summary, I was actually stopped in my tracks by the phrasing Lillian uses for this band. He describes this state as containing collapse-adjacent phenomena.
Collapse-adjacent.
Collapse-adjacent. That sounds apocalyptic. What does that actually mean for a fluid?
It means we're observing the physical limits of the fluid regime itself. Strong localization has taken over completely.
The fluid is barely holding on.
The continuum layer, that smooth baseline state, is hanging by an absolute thread. The fluid is structured to the maximum possible extent allowed by its own atomic bonds.
Unbelievable.
If you push the forcing any higher, if the external energy tries to push Chi past 1, the system will undergo a phase change or a structural failure. It will cease to behave like a fluid.
Give me a tangible, real-world example of what collapse-adjacent phenomena looks like in the wild. Where do we see this?
One of the most common industrial examples is cavitation inside a massive water pump. Imagine a massive steel impeller spinning at incredible speeds, trying to force water through a pipe.
Okay.
The localized pressure drops behind the spinning blades becomes so intense, the fluid is being stretched and sheared so violently that the liquid water literally rips apart. It boils at room temperature, forming microscopic vacuum bubbles of vapor. When those bubbles are carried into higher pressure zones a fraction of a second later, they violently collapse.
Wow.
That collapse sends out localized shock waves that are so powerful they can pit and destroy solid steel over time.
So the water is being tortured to the point where it literally tears itself into vapor to handle the stress.
Exactly. Or consider the aerodynamics of a jet flying at Mach 3. The air right at the nose cone is being compressed so violently that it forms a shockwave boundary.
That extreme closure.
The air in that boundary layer is experiencing extreme closure. The structures are so dense, the temperature so localized, that the very rules of standard fluid mechanics threaten to break down. That is band 5.
It is terrifying, but it's also incredibly profound. It's the ultimate defense mechanism right before the system fundamentally fails entirely.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we understand the ladder. We had the 5 bands from the calm continuum to the collapse-adjacent extreme. But how exactly does a fluid move from one rung to the next? Is it constantly bouncing up and down the ladder?
Not at all.
That brings us to one of the most rigorously argued parts of Lillian's paper, the lemma of ladder ascent, or the mechanics of transition.
This is codified as Lemma 4.3 in Lillian's formal structure. And mathematically, it acts as a logical proof for the directional nature of this transition.
It establishes what we might call a point of no return for the fluid.
Precisely.
I am going to read the basic premise of Lemma 4.3, and then I want you to unpack the logic for us step by step because it's brilliant.
Okay.
Lillian writes that if the forcing that aggregate closure-driving quantity we called Q is constantly increasing, and the fluid's innate smoothing capacity, C, stays relatively constant, the fluid cannot spontaneously return to a smoother state.
It is an ironclad mathematical consequence of the closure equation, chi equals phi of Q divided by C. Let's walk through the proof.
Let's do it.
Lillian specifies a condition where Q is monotone non-decreasing.
Hold on, let me act as a translator here. Monotone non-decreasing. Does that just mean it's a one-way street?
Yes.
Like, the pressure on the system can go up, or it can hold perfectly steady at its current level, but it never ever drops.
That is exactly what it means. The foot is pressing relentlessly harder on the gas pedal, or at the very least holding its current pressure, but it never lets off.
Okay.
Now look at the denominator of our equation, C. The smoothing capacity is largely a fixed physical property of the fluid itself, its inherent viscosity.
It doesn't really change.
While viscosity might fluctuate very slightly with changes in temperature, in the context of this rapidly increasing external physical force, C does not increase sufficiently to compensate.
Okay, so if I remember my basic fraction math from elementary school,
Which I'm sure you do.
if the number on the top of the fraction, the stress, Q, is constantly getting bigger, and the number on the bottom of the fraction, the resistance, C, is essentially stuck staying the same, the total value of the fraction has to get bigger.
Precisely. The ratio of Q over C must increase. And because our normalization function phi is also monotone increasing, the final closure intensity value, chi, must increase.
It has to go up.
Therefore, the fluid's ontological state must either remain on its current rung of the ladder, if the stress hasn't quite pushed it over the next threshold yet, or it must ascend to the next rung.
It is mathematically barred from descending.
It cannot spontaneously relaminarize or suddenly become smooth and peaceful again while it is under unyielding increasing pressure.
The implication of that is massive. It proves mathematically that turbulence is a one-way street under pressure.
It is entirely trapped by the energy being injected into it.
When I was reading this section, I couldn't help but think of a real-world analogy outside of physics to help visualize this.
Let's hear it.
Think about a person in a high-stress corporate job, taking on more and more responsibilities.
Okay.
You start your job, and it's easy. You manage your own time. You were at band 1, but then you were given a new major project, then another. Then you have to manage a team of 5 people.
The pressure builds.
Then you're put in charge of the regional budgets. The external pressure on you, your personal Q variable, is monotone non-decreasing. It is relentlessly going up.
And your inherent personal capacity to handle stress, your baseline hours in a day, and your need for sleep, your C variable remains relatively constant.
Exactly. You can't magically sprout 4 extra arms or add 6 hours to the day.
Yeah.
And because the pressure is going up and your capacity is fixed, you can't just spontaneously go back to those smooth, easy days of entry-level work.
You really can't.
You can't just magically make your workday feel like a calm, slow-moving river while you are actively handling 50 concurrent high-stakes projects. The reality of your situation doesn't allow it.
Unless your boss actually removes the external pressure.
Unless Q actively goes down, you have absolutely no choice but to build more complex internal structures to handle the load.
You ascend your own personal closure ladder?
Right. You start using complex calendar apps. You
Yeah.
delegate to subordinates. You build rigid daily routines.
You structure yourself?
You compartmentalize your day into tiny, highly localized, tightly managed blocks of time. 15 minutes for this meeting, 10 minutes for emails. You become incredibly rigidly structured just to survive the pressure without having a total breakdown.
That is a phenomenal translation of Lemma 4.3. The fluid is doing exactly what you are doing with your rigid calendar blocks. It is strictly compartmentalizing the stress to prevent a total systemic failure.
And it cannot stop structuring itself until the stress is removed.
And when you reach that absolute peak level of necessary organization to survive, when the fluid reaches band 4, we get to what I consider the absolute core of the entire paper.
Let's pull that pin out of band 4. We are now redefining turbulence, looking specifically at the multi-scale hierarchy.
This concept is codified in Lillian's work as Proposition 4.4, which he titles the nested stratification.
The nested stratification.
This proposition is where Lillian takes the seemingly violent, chaotic reality of Band 4, what we historically called fully developed turbulence, and reveals its profound, hidden internal architecture.
So let's make this tangible. What does Proposition 4.4 mean for what we actually observe in the world? When a meteorologist looks up at a massive, dark, churning, terrifying thunderstorm.
Or when they track the jet stream whipping weather systems across the northern hemisphere.
Right. What are they actually looking at structurally, if not chaos?
According to Proposition 4.4, they are not looking at random, broken, chaotic air. They are looking at three defining simultaneous characteristics of a highly ordered system.
What's the first one?
The first characteristic Lillian identifies is distributed partial closures.
What does distributed mean in this context?
It means that in a truly turbulent system, no single swirl, no single vortex, no single shear layer, no matter how massive it is, accounts for the total structure of the flow.
Okay.
The energy management is decentralized. It is distributed across a vast multitude of distinct, localized structures interacting with one another.
Like a decentralized network. A massive thunderstorm isn't just one big spinning top of air.
No, it's a collection of millions of smaller, interacting rotational zones, all sharing the burden of the energy.
Which brings us to the second characteristic.
Yes, which is incredibly difficult for the human mind to visualize, but mathematically essential. Simultaneous scales.
Simultaneous scale. So these distributed closures aren't all the same size?
Far from it. In Band 4 turbulence, tiny microscopic structures, we are talking about eddies that are mere millimeters across, where viscous dissipation is violently burning off heat exist at the exact same time and within the exact same spatial volume as massive macrostructures that might be kilometers across.
They exist concurrently.
They operating concurrently. The macrostructures are managing the bulk kinetic flow, while the microscopic structures are managing the localized thermal dissipation. They're holding the kinetic energy of the system together across vastly different dimensions simultaneously.
That is dizzying to think about. Millimeter-sized structures operating inside kilometer-sized structures.
It's incredible.
So how does the math handle that? How do you calculate the intensity of a system that has a million different structures of a million different sizes?
That is the third characteristic, weighted aggregation. Lillian provides a specific unifying formula for this, which is written as chi effective equals the sum of WK times chick.
Okay, chi effective equals the sum of WK times chick. That sounds like alphabet soup. Break that down for us. What does it actually mean?
It's actually a beautifully simple concept once you see it. What this formula states is that the effective turbulence that we observe with our naked eyes or measure with our weather radar, that is chi effective, is actually a weighted sum.
Okay, a weighted sum.
The symbol for sum just means add them all up. So we take every single different closure mode occurring in the fluid, every tiny eddy, every massive shear layer. Each one has its own individual closure intensity value, chick, and each one carries a specific percentage of the total energy weight, WK.
So the overall storm, the total massive turbulent system, is just the sum total of all those individual structural weights added together mathematically.
Exactly. The observable complexity of a hurricane or the jet stream corresponds directly to the mathematical interaction of these nested closure modes, rather than being the result of an absence of order. It is highly calculated aggregation.
Wait. Nested closure modes. That makes me think of those matryoshka dolls, those wooden Russian nesting dolls.
That is a fantastic image.
Is that a fair analogy for what's happening inside a turbulent fluid?
It is perhaps the most accurate physical analogy you could use.
This is the aha moment. This is the paradigm shift we promised at the very beginning of this deep dive.
It really is.
Turbulence is literally just high-order structures mathematically nested inside other structures, which are nested inside even larger structures. It is an infinite set of fluid dynamic matryoshka dolls.
Exactly right.
You open the massive kilometer-wide macro vortex of a storm, and inside it, you find a dozen smaller, highly structured shear layers.
You open one of those shear layers, and inside it, you find 100 tiny spinning eddies.
You open an eddy, and inside it, you find thousands of microscopic dissipation zones burning off heat.
It is organizing chaos into an incredibly dense, multi-dimensional mathematical order. It is breathtaking when you really visualize it.
It truly is. And realizing that this nested structure exists changes absolutely everything about how we must approach the science of fluids moving forward.
It really changes everything.
Which leads us to our final major topic today, the ripple effects, the implications, and the future outlook of the closure ontology.
Because Lillian isn't just writing theoretical poetry about nesting dolls here. He is proposing a rigid mathematical framework that fundamentally reframes how an entire branch of physics operates.
And this raises an incredibly important question for the scientific community.
It does. If we have been historically wrong about turbulence being disorder, if classical textbooks have fundamentally mischaracterized the nature of fluid transition for over a century, what else in the vast, established field of fluid dynamics needs to change?
What do we do with a century of prior research, of wind tunnel data, of aerospace engineering principles? Do we throw it all out?
That's the brilliance of this paper. Lillian doesn't say, throw all the old textbooks in the trash.
Right.
He essentially says we just need to reorganize them under a much better, much more accurate filing system.
For example, he talks extensively in the paper about reorganizing classical stability theory. Fluid dynamicists and engineers have used things called Reynolds thresholds for decades, right? What exactly is a Reynolds number, and what is Lillian doing with it?
The Reynolds number is a classic foundational calculation in fluid mechanics. Named after Osborne Reynolds, who popularized it in the late 1800s, it essentially measures the ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces in a fluid.
Okay.
It has been highly effective for engineers to predict roughly when a fluid flowing through a pipe will switch from smooth laminar flow to turbulent flow. However, it has almost always been treated as a binary trigger.
A light switch.
A light switch. Below a certain Reynolds number, you use the smooth math. Above it, you switch to the chaotic statistical math.
And Lillian says that binary switch is an illusion.
Exactly. Lillian is saying, keep the Reynolds calculations. They are mathematically sound observations of stress. But stop treating them as a sudden jump between two different physical worlds.
Right.
Instead, he proposes recasting those old-school Reynolds thresholds as mere stages-specific, identifiable rungs within this single, unified continuum-to-closure narrative. A specific Reynolds number doesn't mean the fluid broke. It just means it reached band 3 on the chi dial.
It unifies the entire field.
It does.
Instead of having one set of rules for nice, smooth fluids and a completely different, frustrating set of statistical rules for naughty, turbulent fluids, we now have one single continuous language that describes the entire journey from 0 to 1.
And the future applications for this unified language are massive, especially when it comes to technology and engineering.
Tell us about those.
The executive summary touches on the future development of closure spectra and scale-resolved models. This is where the engineering applications become incredibly exciting and highly lucrative.
Lucrative, wow.
Right now, modeling extreme turbulence, say an aerospace firm trying to predict the exact aerodynamic drag and thermal load on a hypersonic jet traveling at Mach 5, or a meteorological agency trying to model the hyper-localized impacts of a Category 5 hurricane hitting a coastline, requires mind-boggling amounts of supercomputer power.
Because the models are complex.
And it's so expensive because current models are attempting to calculate and predict randomness. They are running millions of statistical approximations because they believe the system is chaotic.
But if you shift from a binary model of chaos to a graded spectrum of chi, if you realize you are actually modeling structure, not chaos.
Exactly. You give engineers and physicists a completely unified, deterministic mathematical language to build much faster, much more predictive models.
Oh, that's huge.
If we can map the closure spectra, if we can write algorithms that predict exactly how those Matryoshka dolls nest at different scales under specific pressures, we can design incredibly efficient jet engines.
We can build wind turbines that extract maximum energy without destroying themselves.
We can design safer aircraft that handle clear air turbulence gracefully.
And we could build climate models that accurately predict localized extreme weather years in advance.
It provides a singular, elegant narrative for diverse phenomena, connecting the microscopic boundary layer thickening on a single turbine blade to the massive intermittent fluctuations of global weather patterns.
It is a totally unified theory of flow.
Yeah.
And it all comes back to realizing that the fluid isn't breaking, it's adapting.
Yes, it is adapting.
Okay, let's bring this all back to you, the listener, as we wrap up this deep dive. Think about the massive intellectual journey we've just taken over the last hour.
It's been a ride.
We started with the traditional, almost defeatist view of physics. That turbulence is just a glitch, a random breakdown of order that we just have to statistically shrug our shoulders at and brute force with supercomputers.
But then we met Lillian's closure ontology.
We learned about the calm, peaceful continuum layer, the slow-pouring honey fighting dynamically to maintain its smoothness with its internal capacity, C.
We watched the external forces, the five horsemen of Q forcing, boundaries, shear, vorticity, and dissipation attack that smoothness.
We watch the mathematical ratio of Q over C relentlessly drive the closure intensity dial, chi, higher and higher.
We climbed the five distinct rungs of the ladder, starting from the peaceful baseline of Band 1, moving through the violent structural competition of Band 3.
We marveled at the awe-inspiring nested matryoshka dolls of Band 4, and we peered over the edge into the terrifying collapse-adjacent limits of Band 5.
And through the strict mathematical logic of Lemma 4.3, we learned that under unyielding pressure, this structural ascent is a one-way street.
The fluid has no choice but to build. The ultimate realization is that a turbulent fluid is actually an intricate, deeply nested hierarchy of order, fighting desperately, elegantly, and beautifully against the stress of its environment.
It is a profound, fundamental shift in perspective. And as we conclude today's analysis, I want to leave you with a final philosophical extrapolation to ponder on your own. A thought that builds directly on Lillian's mathematical work, but takes it far beyond the realm of pure fluid dynamics.
Okay.
If turbulence in a physical fluid is, at its absolute core, simply the structured evolution of order under increasing pressure, could this closure ontology apply to other complex, non-fluid systems experiencing extreme forcing?
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating avenue to go down.
Think about massive human-designed networks. Think about the traffic grids in a major megacity during a sudden, unexpected mass evacuation.
Right.
Or think about global, intertwined supply chains during a worldwide pandemic.
Right.
Or even human societies and political structures during periods of extreme economic or environmental stress.
When these massive, complex human systems seem to break down into what the news calls chaos under immense pressure.
Are they actually breaking, or are they just ascending a closure ladder of their own? Are they forming a dense, localized, multi-scale hierarchies of order compartmentalizing the societal stress, walling off the economic energy, forming logistical eddies and social shear layers to survive, that we simply haven't learned to measure or recognize yet?
Are we mistaking the desperate, highly structured evolution of our own complex systems for a collapse?
It's definitely something to think about.
That is a staggering thought to end on. When we look at the world around us falling apart, are we actually looking at chaos, or are we just looking at a survival order so densely packed, so highly nested that we don't have the maths to read it yet?
Exactly.
That right there is exactly why we do these deep dives, to find those exact questions that change how you view everything. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey today. Keep looking closely at the world around you, keep questioning the definitions in the textbooks you've been handed, and keep finding the hidden, beautiful structures in the chaos. We will catch you on the next deep dive.